If you're a robot, this video isn't for you. But if you have a human brain, chances are you're misapplying the concept of GTO. So let's fix that. Most people misunderstand what GTO means. The traditional way to look at a solver solution is to give it multiple bed sizes and see which ones are used in a specific spot. That is cool, and I'm gonna show you later why it's also important to use a solver for that. But this way of looking at GTO is overrated, especially if you want to use it for playing yourself and improving your win rate. In this hand, Wiktor Malinowski opens the hijack and Misha inner calls. The flop is ace-7-5 rainbow and Wiktor c-bets 30% pot. Solving for a small, a big and an overbet sizing, we'll see that ace-queen in general mixes checks, small bets and overbets. But Wiktor's combo specifically almost never bets. Now one thing we could do is say he played his hand wrong and he should know better. A bit better would be to say, well, using this sizing isn't technically wrong, as it is a frequency play for the solver, which means EV differences are either very small or not existing. And a frequency play is also a good argument to justify everything. But an even better approach would be to acknowledge that we simply don't know his strategy here. What many people don't understand is that this solution is just one possible GTO strategy. But there are way more. And many of them are actually better for humans to use in practice. Because trying to remember and implement this exact strategy in practice will not work. Not if you're human. One proof of that is that on average, regulars on mid-stakes and lower still don't get their preflop ranges right. Even though GTO preflop ranges have been around for years now. In this spot, for example, the average regular on mid-stakes would overfold their big blind against an early position open raise. To find out more about the average player's preflop mistakes, check out my population analysis in preflop exploits, which you can find in the link below. But since these two guys are high stakes players who should be well studied, we can work with GTO preflop ranges here. So let's try to make this c-betting strategy easier to execute. And instead of using 3 bet sizes and a check option, cut it down to just 1 bet size. Since the solver only uses the overbet and the small bet, we can solve for strategies that only use either one of them. And comparing the overall EV of the strategy that only uses the overbet to the EV of the original sim, we see that there's not even a difference. So whether we play this strategy or this doesn't matter, as it makes us the same amount of money, even against the perfect opponent. But obviously, this one is much easier to play. Now, only using the small bet, the EV does decrease a bit, as we see a difference of 0.02 big blinds, which is still less than 0.5% of the pot, so very little. But going a step further, we see an advantage in a small bet strategy that the overbet doesn't have. Because even with 1 bet size, we still have to decide between betting and checking, which is still a lot of frequencies to remember. So let's simplify it down to not having to make a decision at all. Using a range bet with the overbet turns out to be quite an inferior strategy, as it loses a healthy 0.32 big blinds, more than 6.5% of the pot. Not good. Better is a pure checking strategy, but that one also loses 0.11 big blinds, so more than 2% of the pot. If we could get close to or under 1%, that would be great. And the small range bet strategy does exactly that. It's only 0.01 big blinds worse than a strategy using only the small bet, and only 0.03 big blinds, so 0.6% of the pot worse than the original sim with multiple sizes. Which is very little, and it is extremely easy to play. I mean, it's basically impossible to get this wrong. Look down at your hand, if you have a hand, bet it for 30% pot. And boom, you're playing GTO. A slightly worse GTO strategy than what would be possible, but even as a human, you're guaranteed to implement it with a 10 out of 10 execution. So just like the term equity realization, which tells you how much of its equity a hand actually takes home, we could introduce the term EV realization to consider how much of the theoretical EV you're actually likely to take home. And that is going to be lower the more complex a solution is that you're trying to play. So when we see that Wiktor uses a 30% pot size here on the flop, he could be playing, or at least aiming to play, any of these strategies. We can't know from only seeing one hand. Since his combo is such a low frequency in the original sim, I would assume it's more likely he's at least simplifying to one sizing, where it would always be a bet more often than a check. He gets called and the turn is a jack. Going forward, we'll work with this scenario assuming a mixed flop strategy with only a small bet. Against the turn check, using multiple sizing options first, we'll see that this ace-queen combo would always check. But again, we can simplify to one bet size. Fortunately, we can just let GTO Wizard AI choose the bet size that yields the highest EV if only using one, which in this case would be a pot size. And indeed, the EV difference is again only 0.01 big blinds, which is only a bit more than 0.1% of the pot. Unfortunately on the turn, however, simplifying to range bets or checks doesn't give us similar EV to a mixed strategy. Both a range check as well as a range bet make for an EV difference of 5 to 8% of the pot, so we would have to do some mixing here. On the river, we face a bet. And here we see the limits of simplification. You can cut down your own lines to the least amount of bet sizes and options, but you can't control which sizings your opponents use. So there's no way around at least having an idea of what GTO looks like in other lines than the ones you choose. Also, it can help you find and estimate mistakes in your opponent's games, but more on that in a minute. Here, ace-queen is a clear call. And it's not close. There's no mixing and the EVs of calling and raising differ a lot. So why the raise? Well, of course, it could always be because Wiktor simply didn't know, but I don't think that's the case here. Instead, he of course also knows that other humans don't play close to GTO in most spots. And he seemingly doesn't believe Misha is simplifying his strategy down to one bet sizing here. Because if he does use multiple bet sizes on this river, he has to balance his ranges for every one of those bet sizes, which is very difficult. Wiktor might simply assume Misha would rarely or never bet nut hands like king-queen or 8-9 for a 50% pot bet size, but instead think he'd go for an overbet or attempt a check raise, both of which would be part of the solver strategy, but the solver still mixes in some 50% pot bets with these hands. If that doesn't happen in practice, however, and you assume your opponent's 50% bet size range is much weaker than in GTO, you could exploit that by raising more hands for thin value. The problem here is that you don't only need your opponent to have a lot of weak hands, you also need him to have enough hands that are weaker than yours and be good enough to call a raise, which on this board is pretty difficult. There are only a few suited aces, ace-9, ace-8, ace-6, ace-4, ace-3, ace-deuce, because betting the river with king-jack or queen-jack for 50% is rather unlikely to me. 30% maybe, but 50%, I doubt it. But who knows, maybe Wiktor had a reason to think they could. Still, these hands would have to call the raise very often, and Misha would have to re-raise extremely rarely to make this raise profitable. So how should we evaluate this whole play? Well, seeing Misha actually have king-queen in this line is a convincing argument that this play was probably not the best exploit here. And the GTO strategy is a good reference point for that. Because rather than working with a black and white mindset of either being an exploit or not, the GTO strategy tells us how big of an exploit a play is. How far away is a play from the GTO strategy? Here, raising ace-queen is far from GTO. In order for ace-queen to be a raise on the river, Misha's betting strategy would have to be very unbalanced towards weak hands, and his calling strategy would have to be very unbalanced towards calls. And even just the first condition seems to be very unlikely, as he did in fact play king-queen this way. So should you never make any exploits like this and always try to play GTO? Of course not. Just like anything in poker, an exploit doesn't have to work every time for it to be a good play. The thing about a well-executed GTO strategy is, though, that it does work every time. But for us as humans, executing well is the most difficult part. So why not make it as easy as possible? But if you don't want to implement GTO strategies, or just want to improve your exploitative approach as well, this video shows you a guy who specializes in exactly that.